Next, I want to welcome Republican Brian Mast to the studio, who represents Florida's 18th district. So, Congressman, your colleague in the Senate on this issue, Senator Cory Booker, said that if nothing happens on this issue in the lame duck, he doesn't think anything will happen for many years. Your colleague, Congressman Joyce, told me he does not believe it's probably top on the list of priorities for President Joe Biden in the next couple of weeks in the lame duck session before the Democrats lose the House of Representatives. What do you think is possible in the lame duck session on cannabis reform?
So possible to move cannabis reform. The Senate could take up policy that was taken up in this last Congress if they wanted to. They haven't had the desire to do so. That's the Senate side. The House of Representatives side could still take up, say, a Nancy Mace bill, something like that, something very strict on just decriminalization, descheduling of cannabis. I don't think it's entirely likely that be what they take up in the lame duck session. But for me personally, I think that's why, for my assessment, it's more likely in the next Congress. Because speaking from, to give some inside baseball, there's a huge push in my conference, in my delegation, to move forward bills that people can very easily understand. And what I mean by saying that is that they're straightforward. You're not mixing cannabis policy with something else relating to energy policy, with something else in 1,000 or 1,500 pages of legislation. You're putting forward something that's straightforward, that says decriminalization, states' rights. We're not going to argue about the Commerce Clause in this way like everybody likes to do. And it's straightforward. Or you could take your host of issues. That is really the push in our delegation right now, to have those simple, straightforward pieces of legislation, so that people can know exactly what their representatives are, in fact, standing up for, supporting, voting on, and then sending that over to the Senate to say, hey, make a simple up or down decision on this. So I'm actually more hopeful.
Okay, and you co-sponsored the Veterans Equal Access bill in June. How and why have veterans been denied access to cannabis? And you are also, you lost both your legs in the Afghanistan war. Why, from a personal perspective, is this important for veterans? And what would your bill do to address the fact that this is right now prohibited for them?
Yeah. So when we say personal perspective, personally, I'm not a cannabis user. I've never been. I have a lot of fellow veterans that are. Whenever I go into the Department of Veterans Affairs, into the hospital, which is where I get all of my own care, I hear pretty much every time from somebody that wants to speak about this issue. I have friends that I served with that are now out of the military and around the country from all branches of the military. When they want to talk to me, this is one of the biggest issues that they want to talk about, is saying, hey, why can't I have this access through the Department of Veterans Affairs to help me with post-traumatic stress, to help me with pain in this way, to help me with anxiety in this way? Why do I have to be on this product of pharma? Why can't I have what some people would classify as an alternative medicine, something that I believe in more? Why does it have to be this that comes with this laundry list of my kidneys aren't going to work and my liver's going to fail and I might die if I take this together? Why can't we try something different? And that's what has to be able to happen here. And it's not allowed to happen, to answer your question simply, because of the way that marijuana is scheduled, the way that cannabis is scheduled in the federal system. That's why it can't happen. That's why the VA, being a federal agency, won't allow this to move forward. And this is something that we can change and that we should change, not just for the betterment of veterans, but there's a host of individuals that you can look at in the medical sphere. And that's what so many states have been looking at, among many other things.
And Senator Hickenlooper, a Democrat, has introduced the PREPARE Act in the other chamber. It mirrors legislation that you've introduced in the House. Can you tell us what the PREPARE Act and your bill do and why they are important?
Yeah, so you look forward and you say, okay, we're going to allow the Department of Veterans Affairs to have prescriptions for individuals. They can go through the VA to be treated in a way that cannabis is part of that treatment. That's something that we can and should be allowing. This is what we're pushing forward in that, again, but the best pathway forward has to be descheduling to make this work across the board, because what you run into, even though you're dealing with a federal agency, is you run into, let's look at what's gone on the 2022 ballots, right? You had states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Arkansas say on their individual state ballots that they did not want to legalize cannabis use. You had states like Maryland and Missouri say that they do want to legalize cannabis use. Well, if your Department of Veterans Affairs is issuing a card or a prescription to a veteran, but your state law is crossed with what the VA is doing, that puts you in a bad situation. It puts you in a bad situation for a concealed carry permit. It puts you in a bad situation for employment, for insurance, for a host of different things. So we can do this through the VA, and we're going to work on that, but we have to get this done at a much higher level federally for sending this to states across the board.
And on that issue, why do we need federal reform if it's a state's issue? And is there a danger that federal involvement hampers changes in the laws that are being passed at the state level? If the Republican Party is the party of states' rights and they have their unique needs and rights, where does the federal legalization argument come in? What is the Republican conservative argument, federalist argument for legalizing at the federal level?
The argument to say don't do this always comes back to the same old, well, interstate commerce. It's got to be interstate commerce. Federal government has to have total control of this for this reason. And this is, the auspices by which they chose to do this many years ago. That's not sound argument. Do not give this right back to the states to go out there and decide. We already had, 31 states already make the decision to legalize cannabis in their states. Some have made the decision to not legalize cannabis, but that is the pinnacle, getting to decide. It goes and takes the power out of the federal government. Out of my hands is one of 435 U.S. representatives, out of the hands of the federal, the senators in our bicameral body, and says it's going to go to your state legislature, your state house, your state senate, your governors, and they're much closer to you. They're going to decide that for you. That has to be the way. You can't let that interstate commerce argument get in the way of that. Because it's not a consistent argument. It's something that the government loves to use as a blanket on everything to take control. And as a representative, I can tell you that I have yet to see the federal government work overtime to try to give control back to the people. That's what I want to see. I wanted to see that in, a lot of people have arguments in this way, but it's consistent for the Republican argument. You heard us all talk about, hey, we agree with the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade because things should go back to the states. Well, if you're a Republican and you're talking about that Supreme Court decision in that way, then in my opinion, you should be consistent and talk about cannabis legislation in that way and sending it back to the states and a host of other issues. But that's certainly one that was recently in the news.
And so, Congressman, now that the Republicans are taking over the House majority and controlling the chamber, what has changed, in your opinion, in terms of prospects for reform? Is it more favorably disposed with Republicans or less? What is the argument you're making to your Republican colleagues about pushing ahead with this issue? And what's the resistance that you're meeting?
Yeah, so I think the argument gets stronger and stronger every day. It gets stronger with the arguments that were going on during this last political cycle. I just brought up the argument of Roe v. Wade. If you are arguing in this way and you want to be consistent, then argue that same way with cannabis reform. That makes the argument easier when people have to wait. Well, I guess I did talk about states' rights in this issue. So then explain to me what is actually different, because I'm not seeing what is. So be consistent and apply that same policy in the same way. That makes it easier to move legislation if we can have arguments in that way. But like I said, one of the things that in my opinion, gives us a greater ability to advance this in this Republican House of Representatives is going to be our internal push to have simple up or down votes on a myriad of issues that sit in the federal hands right now, from border to immigration policy to a host of other things. Well, let's have those same kind of simple up or down votes on descheduling or what will be scheduled for cannabis. And that gives it a higher prospect, in my opinion.
And what is the kind of arguments from opponents that you are hearing? Are you making progress in that area? But also, what are the arguments that are made in terms of resisting moving forward with legalization? Is it concern for use by minors? What is the resistance that you're coming up against among your colleagues?
So some of the big cases that you hear is simply harm to the body, and which, again, it's a non-consistent argument. When you say tobacco is legalized, alcohol is legalized, you can find those that use something, you can find those that abuse something in nearly anything that somebody can consume in life, right down to things that sit inside of everybody's kitchen. You can use or you can abuse, and you can't use that, as many people do, as the argument to say, well, because there's a potential that somebody would abuse something, we're going to not allow any use of something whatsoever. That is the argument that gets made constantly. Probably the biggest one, hands down. Now, going back to some of those states that had this on the ballot and that will have this on other ballots, if you have a state that moves this on its state ballot, like Maryland or like Missouri, well, that's going to move your federal representatives to also vote differently if they're given the opportunity to vote at the federal level to decriminalize, to deschedule that. So that's something that helps as well. But hands down, the health, what could this lead to for an individual? What are the side effects? One of the other big ones that people bring up is a difference in potency today versus a potency in, let's say, 1975. That's one of the arguments that's brought to me fairly regularly.
And what's your response? Because we all hear this argument. What is your response about the difference in potency now versus years ago?
My response is to use that same word, consistency. Be consistent, again, because we're not looking to say that if I want to go to a bar, I have to have this beer that's, 8% alcohol by volume, or I can't have this one that's brewed in a whiskey barrel that's this percent alcohol by volume, or this spirit or this spirit or this spirit. You're not making the argument consistently to me if you haven't been writing legislation to rein that in the exact same way. So again, it's just be consistent. To my colleagues on either side of the aisle, be consistent with what your policies are over here and apply those to cannabis legislation, and you will find yourself in the camp of saying it needs to be decriminalized. Veterans need to have access in the VA. Individuals across the country need to have access based upon what their states are saying, and that's the boat that we get to.
So the most recent Pew Research poll from October showed 88% of Americans support legalization for recreational and medical use. You mentioned Maryland and Missouri just passing ballot initiatives in this most recent election, and you're making the case that more and more states approving this will lead to more and more support from their federal representatives. Why is Congress still so far behind the public and the states on this issue in 2022?
Well, whenever Congress is behind on something like that, make no mistake, it is a conscious decision. It's not as that, well, there was just too many other things that were on the ballot, and so we didn't take that. No, if that stuff wants to go through the Judiciary Committee for decriminalization, well, it can be moved through the Judiciary Committee pretty rapidly, or put on the agenda pretty rapidly for 2 months from now or 5 months from now. It can be done if the will is there. There are always people that want to be protected from taking what they consider, quote unquote, tough votes, because they don't want to have to piss off half the people on one side and half the people on the other side. So they're going to put pressure to say, hey, please don't bring this to the floor. Please don't bring this to committee, because we don't want to have to take that vote. That's always one of the inside baseball problems that you get. There's always pressure from lobbying interests, right? Just like there's an interest that wants to see more of a libertarian approach, a states' rights approach to this. And that is good for the cannabis business to have that approach. There's another side of it that doesn't want to see this unless it's going to fall under models that are going to benefit them in terms of their revenue, not take away from whatever pharmaceutical sales, or not take away from whatever recreational sales that somebody's ingesting currently in this sphere. And so if legalization will take away from that, then somebody's going to be pushing away from that. And that's unfortunately, but realistically, the way that Washington works.
Okay, so it makes a lot of sense. You said that your delegation is interested in prioritizing standalone legislation that people can understand, that's not confused by being connected to other issues and controversial items. If you could pass one incremental reform for cannabis in this last session of Congress, or by the end of the session of Congress, what would that reform be?
It would be decriminalized. That is it's the gold standard, but it's the baseline for what needs to happen as well. That's the middle of the road, in my opinion. People always say, "Well, how do you be middle? How do you be centrist?" And my answer to individuals is always this: I think the most centrist, the most middle that somebody can be is to be constitutional. And there can certainly be constitutional arguments made either way, but in my opinion, that's what reins people in from the left, from the right. The Constitution is my interpretation of that says that the Constitution deems this is an issue that should belong to the states. So let's give it to the states. And the states have already been begging for this in terms of voting on it. Voting on it in their own state legislatures is begging to have control of it. Whether they vote yes or vote no, it's saying they want to have a hand in making the determination for the state of Missouri or the state of Maryland or Arkansas or North Dakota, South Dakota, Florida, whatever state it may be. They want to have that hand.
Congressman Mast, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your service.
Thank you. Appreciate it.